My name is Michael Liebreich, and this is Cleaning Up. My guest this week is Jonathan Maxwell. We've got together here in my house for a socially distanced conversation. Jonathan, apart from being a good friend, is also the CEO and founder of SDCL. That stands for Sustainable Development Capital Limited. He's one of the biggest investors in the world, and almost certainly the biggest in Europe, in energy efficiency, which he defines as cheaper, cleaner, and more reliable energy. For disclosure, I am also a senior advisor to SDCL. So let's bring Jonathan into the conversation.
Thanks for having me, Michael.
It's a great pleasure. I'm tempted to ask you what you've been up to today, but we might never get into the meat of what we're supposed to be talking about. But what have you been up to today?
On my way here, looking forward to it.
Okay, just preparing for this conversation. You know, I have to start by talking about the first time that we met, or in fact we didn't meet, because I was told that I must meet you by a mutual friend. And I thought, Maxwell, I was starting New Energy Finance. We were a very nascent business, and I thought, I don't need any scandal. I don't need any Maxwells in my business. And then I discovered afterwards, only once we had actually met, that you're from a different bit of the Maxwell. Well, how does that work?
Well, my father's name was Mizelas.
Mizelas, so not Maxwell at all.
But people couldn't spell it. So my mother, the deal when they got married, convinced him to change his name to Maxwell. So there you go. So
my fears were unfounded. There was not a bit of Maxwell about you, and not a bit of crookedness, which is very good news. So now I gave in the preamble, I described that you now run SDCL, right? Yeah. But I want to kind of start by just, you've been on this journey to become a major investor in energy efficiency. Talk me through where that started.
So before I set up SDCL, I was with HSBC Infrastructure, and I had an extraordinary opportunity, really, which was to get involved in, social infrastructure funding for projects around schools, hospitals, long-term infrastructure services. Frankly, the stuff that society doesn't function without, if you like, the financial structures that sat behind the creation of a lot of these sorts of solutions in the UK. I led the IPO actually of the first listed infrastructure company in Europe back in 2006, which was the HSBC Infrastructure Company when I was working at HSBC. And then I had
let me just jump in there. Sorry, just one thing, because not all of our audience knows what an IPO is, what an infrastructure company is, and so this is taking a bunch of assets, big things, you put them in a vehicle, and then you float it on the London Stock Exchange. So, what sort of assets was it?
So it's a great question, actually, because infrastructure assets, at the end of the day, are contracts, and it was a contract. These were a portfolio of contracts between government in those cases and investors. And investors put up the money to build something. It might be a school or a hospital, maybe even a.
So are these PPP?
These are public-private partnerships.
Right, these were back in the PPP day contracts. Right.
Contracts. So they would be 20, 30-year contracts. The deal for the investor is that the investor, together with an industrial group, took the risk to build the project. Once it was commissioned, they would get a long-term contracted income from the project.
Okay.
And that's fundamentally what it is, a public-private partnership.
So that's an attempt to explain a little bit more, and if people didn't understand it, then it's financial engineering to finance stuff that people wouldn't normally associate with putting into a quoted vehicle.
It's real, what they call real assets.
Real assets.
So,
right.
But I think the other point about it is that it's basically spreading the cost, which could be quite expensive, of a large infrastructure project over the useful life of its.
But these were not energy assets. This was not. You hadn't had the epiphany about energy efficiency at that point,
no.
Right? And then you ended up. So I know that you ended up in China.
Yeah.
I'm not quite sure how you got there, but you still weren't doing energy in China, right?
Correct. So that deal happened in 2006, and I had this fantastic opportunity to go to China for HSBC.
With HSBC still, okay.
And to look at, after that infrastructure deal, to look at ways in which we might start investing in Chinese real estate. And, you know, I think you used the word epiphany, but at least the eye-opener for me was arriving in Beijing. So this was mid-2006. And I couldn't see down the street because of the pink, at that time, the pink dust in the atmosphere in the street. And, you know, I was doing a lot of reading, looking sort of why there was so much, you know, sort of dust or sort of pollution. There are lots of reasons, but one of the reasons back then in 2006 was deforestation. And deforestation outside of Beijing had created sandstorms, or effectively dust, that would just come straight into the center of Beijing. And so it started opening my eyes as to what environmental degradation can do. And in fact, the further work I was doing around China at the time, whether it was basically, you know, sort of dust coming in from the desert into Beijing, or it was construction dust in Shanghai. You know, what I was
coal dust as well?
Coal particulates. In different cities, there's coal particulates. But I think, you know, what I was starting to see with my own eyes was air pollution. And the other thing that I started to see with my own eyes, which is real problems with things like geotechnical problems with trying to buy real estate. Sometimes the aquifers were depleted. So
geotechnical meaning subsidence.
Subsidence.
Which is another form of environmental degradation.
Correct.
Yeah. And around this time, I'm trying to remember, because I was running this tiny, which year are we talking here? This was 2006. 2006. So I had started New Energy Finance and was, I'd raised a little bit of finance in January and was, you know, struggling, running 1,000 miles an hour trying to get the thing stood up. And there was one thing which I remember from around then, which is a report that said it was a report on China's environment. You know, China was just regarded, at least by me, as this kind of mysterious life force that was just growing at, you know, at that time, probably 11, 12, 14% per year. And we all knew that there were environmental problems, even though, you know, that wasn't, I didn't have your experience. But there was a report that came out that said that environmental damages were costing the Chinese economy, and the number was some enormous amount, like more than 10% per year. And I remember looking at this and thinking, come on, I mean, is that real? Can that really be? And what dodgy methodology, you know, could that use? And so on. So do you recall that?
Yeah. So that report was created by something called at the time the State Environmental Protection Agency, together with Western economists. And what it basically said, it broke down the loss of GDP from water and air pollution, from acid rain, from deforestation.
So you remember that report as well. So you were seeing this stuff, and then you remember the analysis, which said,
it's an extremely important report. For me, if you asked about epiphany, for me that was a massive eye-opener. And in fact, the report pointed to up to 12% per annum loss
12 was the number,
of GDP from environmental degradation. Yeah. So the link came back to me to say, well, you know, look, you know, if the economy, the real economy, can be degraded, or, you know, this kind of value can be taken or suffered by the economy because of environmental degradation, then surely there's an investment case to start investing in what I was describing as environmental infrastructure. So there's the tie. You know,
so you called it at the time environmental infrastructure. You hadn't made the jump to calling it energy efficiency. It's very interesting, because my epiphany when I was thinking of starting New Energy Finance was realizing that effectively, you know, 60, 70% of all energy, primary energy, is just waste.
Yeah.
And thinking, well, but I know that there are technologies that can, whether it's the fuel cell that I now have in the basement of this very building, or whether it's wind and solar, there are, you know, and it was maybe similar. I just thought, this is billions and billions and more per year if you can just close that gap.
It's the same.
It's the same.
It's the same issue that after I was got sort of fascinated in this concept of environmental infrastructure, and can we do deals with, this is my fundamental question, is can you do the same sort of deal that you do to finance a school or hospital or railway link to actually finance environmental infrastructure that's also critical for society? But the leap, maybe it took me longer than it took you at New Energy Finance, but after a few years, that loss, that 70% of energy being wasted or 60% of energy being wasted, that's really where I highlighted.
Yeah.
And that's why I ended up focusing on.
And I'm not sure that I was any faster, by the way, because, in retrospect, I think Steve Jobs says that, you can always, you can only join the dots, looking backwards. One of my favorite quotations, because, now I can say, I had this insight and I started the business. No, I didn't. I was running around doing all sorts of things, climbing in the Andes and, following the news about the Gulf War. And now it seems pretty obvious, but at the time it took a few years, to be honest, just like you. So now, did you start to do what you call environmental infrastructure in China, or did you think, right, I had this massive epiphany idea, I got to get back to the UK to make it happen?
Yeah, well, I went back to HSBC in London. I said we needed to set up a division of the bank just to focus on environmental infrastructure. It wasn't the right timing for HSBC, so I, in very friendly terms, left and set up Sustainable Development Capital as a place to focus. And it was really, I think, two things I was very interested in. One of which was this concept of environmental infrastructure. The other one of which is going on a bit of a journey to figure out where the inefficiencies were in the energy space. Yeah. So that's really what got the business started. And I really just wanted to set up an institution that just focused on those problems and not went off into funding airports or toll roads and things like this, but focused entirely on this sort of sector. So that's really what got me started.
And it's an interesting question for large companies. I mean, why did HSBC not say, well, look, we don't fully understand it, but you've been out in China and you've seen this stuff. Why don't you take a year or two try and figure it out within HSBC? Because you're building this very successful business, but HSBC does not now own it. And presumably, had they come and offered you the right, nice office and a couple of analysts and whatever, you may well have stayed there and built it or not.
Yeah, and that probably had less grey hairs as well.
Possibly, yeah.
Look, I mean, I think, it wasn't the right timing. It was a sort of break of mould, if you like. And I think that's hard to do in existing institutions.
No, and that's what I'm fascinated by, because, I started New Energy Finance, which of course was eventually acquired by Bloomberg. But it's not the only example. The world is full of examples where large corporates, they just can't take a senior person, which you would have been at that point. And, like myself, I'm 20 years out of business school, and I started New Energy 15 years out. They just can't take such a senior person and have them kind of do nothing obviously productive for a couple of years. And it does take a couple of years, doesn't it, to kind of figure out how long did it take for you to kind of do your first transactions from getting back from China?
Well, quite a while. I mean, we got going as a firm. We got going quite well, actually, in sort of 2007. So we're 13 years old, more or less, now. So 10th of October 2007, we got started. I mean, we were doing advisory work, Michael, for a while, but this sort of fascination.
Advisory, so deal by deal, just helping.
A little bit, helping, in fact, ironically, helping investors like investment funds and firms like HSBC and the World Bank and Asian Development Bank look at how to bring private capital into what I was describing at the time as environmental infrastructure. The term caught on back then.
So I'm very keen during these conversations to sort of, to remain accessible to those who are not very financial. So advisory work is really just helping people to find deals, to structure deals, to think through where to put money, right?
Yeah. Well, I often think of investment or financing as something, it's really two things, capital and help.
Capital and help. Okay.
So for the last decade, we've had the good fortune to be able to manage money and therefore to provide capital. But I guess before that, and from 2007 to 10, we were really providing help. And the first type of help was helping investors like HSBC and other sort of public sector institutions in 2008, 9, 10, figure out how to bring private capital into environmental infrastructure. We got a big opportunity to really focus in on this energy efficiency problem, though, because in 2010 we started getting advisory, in other words, help us mandates from some big corporates. And they were
Right.
very interested in where their carbon was in their business. And they identified that really the bulk of their carbon was in their supply chain. The supply chain was in China.
That's right, because this was the period of all of the kind of people were trying to go carbon neutral.
Right.
They were all making great promises. We'll go carbon. News International is going to go carbon neutral, all that sort of stuff. And then, of course, they have to work out what it means.
Right.
Having said it.
Right. Actually,
Right.
that was good for us because we were then set. The question was, where is the carbon efficiency? Where did we make the savings?
Right.
And we were mandated to try and find those savings. And the hunting ground, the biggest hunting ground was in the supply chain. And the biggest supply chain was in China. And the biggest source of the carbon was in the factories. So it all gravitated, Michael, towards energy efficiency.
And I remember at that time, Walmart, everybody wanted to kind of persuade Walmart to go off to China and bounce on their supply chain because they realized that I think there was some huge proportion of Chinese exports, like 6% was actually supplying Walmart or some ridiculous figure like that. Okay, good. So that's your kind of journey to energy efficiency, because you now don't talk about environmental infrastructure, you talk about energy efficiency. And energy efficiency through the whole time that I built New Energy Finance, Bloomberg New Energy Finance, until quite recently, was always the sort of the unloved stepchild of all of this.
Yeah.
But you always loved it. It was like, this was your thing. What was it that you saw that frankly a lot of people didn't see about energy efficiency? Kind of what was it? Is it because it was such attractive, easy pickings deal wise? I don't think it was that, or is it the importance of the sector?
So, I think the first thing is you mentioned your reason for starting New Energy Finance, which was, once you figure out that the energy system wastes 70% of the energy before it gets to the point of use, and then another 20-30% of the energy once it gets to the point of use.
But now you make me feel guilty because I realised that, started the business, and then went off and spent most of my time covering, wind, solar, and then, natural gas and nuclear and batteries and smart grid, and I kind of...
Which is amazing. And you created this ecosystem or lexicon around clean energy without which energy efficiency wouldn't function.
Right, but today. I didn't.
And you performed after all these years.
But I didn't. I couldn't. We actually tried, but we couldn't sell information about energy efficiency. There just weren't enough Jonathan Maxwells in the world that we could create a market on. So you saw something that was different.
So I saw a gap. And I knew the gap would be hard to fill because there is this sort of fundamental problem, and it's complicated as to why so much energy gets lost between the point of generation and end use. And then it's also fiddly and complicated about why buildings and, say, even the transport sector waste so much energy in the process. So this was going to be a hard task. It wasn't that sexy, candidly, 10 years ago. I think it is now, but I don't think it was very sexy 10 years ago. I remember asking somebody who'd been in the business for a long time, since the 70s and 80s, why doesn't energy efficiency get the same attention? He still, to this day, gave me the best possible answer, best answer I've ever heard, which is real men build power plants.
Right, yeah. Of course, real men build fossil fuel power plants, not renewables. Hopefully there are now a lot of women building power plants and increasingly clean power plants.
Absolutely, and actually we've got some very nice shiny power plants that don't these days produce.
But it's true. It is the eye-catching thing, is the supply side. But talk to me about the demand side. Now that we've got such nuanced understanding of the climate challenge. What is the relative importance of demand and supply side, and how do you see it?
So I think the way I see it is endorsed, I think, this year by people like the European Commission, who have basically said, look, if we're going to meet 2030 carbon emission reduction targets, we have to think different. Like the last decade which was fantastic, it's about bringing renewables onto the electricity system. You and I know that electricity is part, but by no means all, or even most of the energy.
20% of energy.
But great, we had this fantastic, decade for renewables. But actually, the only way to meet carbon emission reduction targets for 2030 is to reduce the size of the cake. That's the fundamental story behind the European Commission's energy efficiency, or rather even in energy policy for the next 10 years.
But it really goes back. I mean, it's not just the EU. I mean, this is IEA. I think they've been saying for more than a decade that sort of half of the heavy lifting has to be done by the demand side. And if you go back to, I think there were these things back in the midst of time, there were these things called Sokolow wedges.
Right.
And if you didn't do energy efficiency, you just weren't going to get there.
Right.
And I'm not sure. I think that's as true. Well, it is. I was a commissioner. The IEA had a commission for the urgent. It was the IEA Commission for Urgent Energy Efficiency.
Right.
And I love that juxtaposition of urgency with energy efficiency. Probably never been attempted before. And certainly the thesis there was, if we don't do the energy efficiency and up our hit rate there, then all the stuff you do on the supply side simply can't get us to the climate goals.
That's
certainly not by 20. We have these ferocious goals that we need to hit. Yeah.
So we need at least 3% per annum, don't we, between now and 2030?
Right. So that's 3% per annum of energy. Actually, it's probably energy efficiency, energy productivity, 30%.
Right.
Because the targets, which I've talked about in previous episodes with people like Cristiano Figueres and others, we've got to achieve for 1.5 degrees. We need something like a 50% reduction in emissions by 2030. Right. And then if we don't do that, then if we do a 25% reduction, then we'll get to 2 degrees. And I think we probably at the moment we're kind of bending the curve, but we won't even get to 25. Right. And obviously getting 30% out of energy efficiency, you kind of have to adjust then for economic growth and supply side. We have a chance of getting somewhere that's not horrendous.
Right. So let's be really provocative, okay? And let's say, go back to this point or epiphany, whatever you call it. Say, okay, if we're wasting 60 to 70% of the energy in the economy between generation, transmission, and energy use, I mean, that's massive. Energy is one of the biggest inputs into the economy, and we're wasting most of it, right? I mean, and that's before it gets to point of use.
I'll tell you, the narratives and the choice of words and all of this is absolutely fascinating because for me, sustainability means environmental, social, and economic sustainability. So I've got this thing going on in the Alps, moving mountains, and we look at sustainability of mountain regions, and it's got to be environmental, social, and also economic. Otherwise, it's just not appropriate. But I will say that quite a lot of people on the right absolutely hate the word sustainable. They absolutely hate it because it just seems fuzzy and it seems unfocused and an attempt at a sort of land grab of the state or of nanny state or the commissars.
Well, that comment, if it's not commercial, it's not sustainable, was put to me in 2006 in Hong Kong by a commercial lawyer, not by an environmental.
And a Hong Kong commercial lawyer is a pretty
very
commercial
person.
So
this is not an environmental statement. And I think it's a big point to make, Michael, because you talk about sort of the left and right. This is where in my view, this is where it collides, right? It all coincides and comes together because you've got a conservation concept. Conservation really is don't waste. Yeah. And then you've got an economic argument here, which is this is the way to get better productivity and growth in the economy. And as the IEA, the International Energy Agency, has identified, $1 million spent on energy efficiency not only is great for economic productivity and environmental performance, but it creates 15 jobs.
Okay, so and I'm obviously what I've been spending my time doing, so I agree that this is a way of bringing together all the stakeholders. It's just an interesting one that the language can sometimes create barriers, even though the concepts ought to be unifying. So when you use energy efficiency, fabulous, right? And 75% money on the floor waiting to be picked up, great for the economy. But it's sort of a case of for things to stay the same, everything has to change, to use that great Lampedusa quote, because it's everywhere in the economy, and you have to change everything you do. What are the things, where are the most productive sort of sectors or business models that you have then been you've divided that enormous blob of opportunity into chunks.
Right.
And what are the chunks? Where do we look for those opportunities?
So let's talk about the built environment, and then we'll come back to transport. Buildings, the built environment or buildings use about 40% of the world's energy, and therefore produce about 40% of the world's carbon.
So it's kind of buildings, industry, transport, agriculture, and probably some other.
Right.
Really, okay.
I mean, that's the energy system. But
I'm hoping people are imagining a pie chart out there in internet. Think of a pie chart. So 40%, a big slice is built environment.
Right. And so what's going on inside that slice or box? So I think that's what you're asking. So within that, a big area, fascinating area, very topical for what we're doing now is data centers and information communication technology. This is a massive user of energy in any economy. It's growing quickly.
Let's come back to what you're going to do about it, but let's list a few of the chunks that you see in that.
Another big area, again, pretty topical today, is hospitals.
Hospitals, right. Because the NHS has just announced its net zero plan
very exciting.
In the UK. Yes.
It sounds wonderful. And then the third area that we've really focused on at the moment is manufacturing.
Right.
And I think if you just before you come to anything else, huge opportunity on the data center market. I think it's about improving the way in which data centers improve their efficiency, and there are two elements to it. One, which is quite often overlooked, I'm afraid, is the way that the energy actually gets into the data center. So it's the supply side. There's a tremendous industrial focus on data centers around the actual coefficient or the efficiency of the data center itself.
The heat production and the cooling. Because at one point, data centers were sort of 2%, they were 1% of energy demand. Yeah. I'm talking about probably 2010.
Right.
But you could just see the trend. You thought, well, if they don't become more energy efficient, they're going to become, I think it was like 33% of all.
Yeah.
And then, of course, I don't know whether it was you or others, but, that curve sort of flattened a lot, didn't it?
The curve flattened a lot, except that 30% number is a real number in certain locations.
Right.
So there are hotspots in Europe like
Dublin, Luxembourg,
Denmark. And within those contexts, the strain that puts on the electricity network is very.
So you take an end-to-end supply right the way through to heat.
I think you have to look, when we talk about energy efficiency, I think you have to look at it as a system, and you have to look at the way that the energy gets generated, transmission, and distributed to the building, as well as the way that the building uses and processes that energy. And in data centers, the scale of these data centers is very substantial now. I mean, we're talking about sort of what they call hyperscale data centers getting up to 100 megawatts, which in households or people is enough to power probably 100,000 homes, depending on where you are in the world. So it's a very, very substantial amount of energy demand. Clusters of data centers in cities, particularly, for example, in South Dublin, will put tremendous strain on the grid and potentially compete for energy use for residences. So, the energy system is very important. How do you supply it? How do you get it? Is it renewables? Is it fossil fuel that is going to generate that power that gets to the data center? And then the second point is how you improve the efficiency or reduce the energy demand inside the data center.
Let's just stick with data centers for a second, then I want to hear about some of the other things. But what do you can you go to a completely net zero data center? Because of course you can always buy green energy, but does it appear at the right time of day?
Right.
What's the best way of dealing with your data, with the data center? What have you found in all of them? You've looked at every different solution.
Yeah. So, I said there's a lot of work being done on this where a lot of data center operators are actually hugely committed. The great thing about the sector is that almost all of them are completely committed to net zero.
And they've got lots of cash flow from their business, their core business.
The problem is matching their load.
Right. Matching their load. Let's explain, because not everybody will know what that means. What does that mean?
They use energy all day, all year.
And
And the wind doesn't.
No, it goes up and down.
More or less flat.
Is it more or less flat? Okay.
If you add capacity, it goes up a bit.
So at midday, they can use solar power and say we're all virtuous. And when it's windy, they can use wind power and say we're all virtuous. But it's the bits in between.
Bits in between.
Right.
So, I think that's what we mean by matching the load. It's looking for the renewable production and then trying to sort of figure out how they, at all times, they're actually supplied by clean energy. That's a serious challenge.
Yeah.
And it's a serious challenge that one or two of the software companies refer to as their 24/7 challenge.
Yeah.
And that's an exciting challenge for companies like ourselves, where we can look at our combination of on-site generation together with, matched with renewable supply in the market.
Can you not sort of just jump to hydrogen and say, okay, well, we'll use the solar and the wind and whatever, we'll make hydrogen and then we'll power it on hydrogen and we've matched it? Is that not a thing yet?
It's a thing that we're always looking at how to do. It's quite a significant challenge today because we have to figure out how to make the hydrogen, and you can make it from natural gas.
So there's an interim step, isn't there? I mean, I'm leading you towards.
No, you know the answers, but yes, I think you've got to figure out where you want to get to, and where we want to get to in 15, 20 years time is a situation where there's enough green gas or even hydrogen in the gas grid, or even replacing the gas in the gas grid, that the fuel can transition from natural gas over towards other types.
So there is kind of buying your electricity through wind and solar, but there's another way, which is the CHP solutions, buying gas, combined heat and gas, which you generate the electricity, you then use the heat for cooling, and eventually you'll jump over to probably using hydrogen or something else.
Right, and and we are building within our portfolio. We're building projects which run on waste gases. We're running on bioenergy, and we're also building projects.
Waste gas, but that's the industrial.
Yeah, but within the data center sector, we're also delivering projects which sometimes use natural gas. If they use natural gas, we always look at offsetting that with procurement of green gas to ensure that the supply is right. But the key thing is making sure that the productive energy is used. So we can use, when you have a generator, you're producing two things, electricity and heat. We use the electricity for the data center, and we transform the heat into cooling for the data center or heating for a distributed energy network.
So it's massively more efficient. Without even, although it leaves a little bit of, it does leave a footprint, but it is massively more efficient.
In round numbers, it should be double the efficiency of the grid.
Right. And you also mentioned hospitals, and to me, hospitals is a way of talking about, you sort of missed on your list. You went data centers, hospitals, and then waste gas and things, but just buildings, just the building envelope, the lighting, all of that stuff. And that's, because that's a big piece as well.
It is,
and you jumped over that, but you mentioned hospitals, and you've done some great projects in hospitals.
Yeah, I mentioned hospitals because not all buildings use energy all day, all night, and all year. Of course, data centers do, and hospitals do too. And in fact, they typically, both of them, you mentioned 1% for 2% for data centers. 1%, 2% of energy use in any country is always hospitals.
Hospitals, right.
So it's a huge energy user. NHS in the UK is one of the biggest energy buyers in the UK. And again, there is a fantastic opportunity to introduce efficiency, and there's two combinations, both on the supply side by producing on-site energy generation. We've got a project in London which we are very proud of, where we're an on-site utility for St Bart's Hospital, England's oldest hospital. So we're doing on-site generation, but the other thing that you can do in hospitals is obviously reduce demand for energy. And that's through things like lighting, heating, ventilation, air conditioning, and so on. So hospitals is a big opportunity.
And then what about other? You talked about some waste gases, and I'm like, waste gases of what? What are we talking about there?
So I mean, we've got examples that we've been working on in heavy industry and also in agriculture. So if I just break those out a bit, on the heavy industry side, we have a portfolio of projects which actually takes effectively gases that would otherwise be pollutants and uses the gases and the heat associated with those gases to generate energy, electricity and steam back for steel mills. So it's effectively recycling.
So it's interesting because it's not that example, and also the CHP example.
Yeah.
You're not sort of shooting for perfection, at least not initially. I mean, because these are still at the end of it, there will still be some energy, some heat lost from the flue gas or the waste gas.
Well, we'll define perfect. How do we define
net zero? We've all got to get to net zero.
Okay, but so I'll give you a great example. It's a perfect example. If we take our steel mill projects in the United States, so what we're doing is we're taking the waste flue gases and we're using those to recycle the energy, effectively the heat, back into steam and electricity back for the steel mills. So it's recircular. It's recycling the energy. We get renewable energy certificates for those projects. So let's compare that to perfection. If we define perfection as a solar panel, for instance, then we're actually generating 1.5 renewable energy certificates for every one that an equivalent solar panel.
But is that because of a regulatory kind of arbitrage? There's a regular, or is it because that really is such a waste of energy that such a substantial? Right.
It's because the measurable and verifiable production impact is so much more efficient. Yeah. The second sort of waste gas that we use, for example, is we have projects in Spain which address waste in the food industry. In fact, we've been talking about energy all day today, but and obviously energy and climate are synonymous, but food is even more wasteful than the energy sector. I think there was in consultants' reports saying 92% of food is wasted. Actually, we in the olive industry where we're active in Spain, that's about right. About 92% of the actual olive tree bush
doesn't end up as calories in the olive oil.
Correct.
Right.
So it's very
kind of broad definition of waste. But yes.
So what we look at there is how to sort of effectively reprocess or recycle the waste.
Right. And that's a real thing that you're doing with olives.
That's a real thing we're doing with olives. And what it does is effectively we've got an olive processing facility, and we take the olive pomace cake that comes out of that waste process, and we use that as biomass to create renewable power back to the grid. So that is what they call in Spain a circular economy type of project, but it's creating efficiency. It's recycling waste, and what we're also doing through our cogeneration projects in Spain is providing heat to the olive industry.
Now, I'm going to take a small intermission because you've just reminded me of my favourite energy joke.
Okay, go on.
Which is, a year is a long time in oil. Not if you're an olive. I'm sorry, I had to do that. We've got to keep this thing. These conversations go an hour, and we have to try and keep people on the podcast, on the YouTube. Yeah, it's a good one, isn't it? But you've also, moving on from olives, you've also transportation. You've got 40%, which is kind of fixed, and it's buildings or it's or associated things like data centers and some waste gases and so on. But transport, enormous opportunities, and if you really define it the same way you have the olive industry, how many calories go from the extracted oil to driving, one human from A to B. Right. There must also be 92% or some huge number wasted. So how are you trying to unpack that?
So I mean, that you and I would know that there's a massive inefficiency of basically taking petrol and turning it into the useful energy to move a heavy car or bus or truck around, or diesel. So, I mean, obviously, electrification of transport has an energy efficiency associated with it. We're really interested in providing, and we are investing quite heavily at the moment in providing energy efficient electric vehicle charging infrastructure.
So you've done a transaction to fund the rollout of EV infrastructure.
Correct. So this market is at a relatively early stage of maturity, but I think
but you've managed to turn it into an infrastructure deal, sort of deal that you can then apply a low cost of capital to.
But I think we're in that particular case, we're providing the infrastructure that utilities can then use to deliver fast charging stations to their customers across the country. It's an exciting project, but it's also relatively simple as far as our investment is concerned. Really interested in the scaling up of the electric vehicle market, whether it's cars, fleet electrification makes a tremendous amount of sense. But there's another angle to it. I mean, we've talked about climate change and energy efficiency today. there's another big angle to this with electrification of transport, which obviously is air pollution.
Sure.
I mean, my kids live around the corner from here. They're 5 and 8. I really don't want them growing up in a city with levels of air pollution that's 4 times the level considered safe by the World Health Organization. To be honest,
without getting party political, but nevertheless political, it's much easier for mayors, municipalities to act on air pollution in many cases than it is on climate, because people feel it viscerally. You see your kid coughing or with asthma or whatever, your elderly relatives. You want action, don't you?
Don't more people die of premature lung disease in London than they do from road traffic accidents?
I was on the Board of Transport for London. I'll know the answer to that. The answer is yes. The answer is yes. So road traffic accidents, it's only a few hundred that die, but it is tens of thousands that die from air pollution.
So, personally,
and by the way, just for the record, both are unacceptable. Both are way too high. If people really understood what was the avoidable risk that they're being forced to take just by living in London. And by the way, it's not just the poor area. The poorer areas in some cases do very badly, and because they live near main roads and so on. But it's also some of the worst air pollution is in places like Kensington, Chelsea, Putney High Street. Posh bits of London. It's an equal opportunity killer.
No, look, I'm completely on board, and so people often equate electrification of transport to climate, whereas actually this is a much more local climate issue, if you like. I think then of course you've got the heavy trucks and vehicles, you've got ships, and this is a massive area for opportunity.
And I know, because I am an advisor to SDCL, that we are starting to look at opportunities to finance not just the charging infrastructure, but actually potentially the vehicles, because they are so different from traditional vehicles. Their lifetime is, we have the 1 million mile battery. I mean, what does that mean? We're going to end up with a 1 million mile car? And if so, what does that do to the leasing companies? Nobody knows this stuff, do they? Nobody knows this stuff.
But, what we do know is, that a lot of transport infrastructure, or vehicles, if you like, are managed by fleet operators. We see two-wheelers moving goods and services around. Now we've been through lockdown.
Drones and automated autonomous vehicles are going to be doing deliveries.
Right, but last mile logistics, deliveries all across the country. In fact, our economy wouldn't work without the internet or indeed, that kind of delivery capability. So this is actually a massive opportunity to introduce efficiency.
So I think this is actually one of the really big points. Instead of framing it necessarily as energy efficiency, that clean energy, clean transportation, public transport, all of it is actually about more capex and lower running costs, because there's no fuel. There's no fuel. And this has implications right the way up to treasuries, interest rates, macroeconomic implications, and that's nowhere has that been encapsulated. We're all kind of feeling around that issue, that this is becoming a world where there are no fuel costs. There are almost no running, and if it's electrification, very low maintenance costs. So but a lot of the users of those services, those energy and transport services, don't have access to capital the way that you, Jonathan, and SDCL have access to capital, and low capital, low cost of capital.
You've just used an interesting phrase. You said users of those services. Actually, they're not usually procuring them as services. They're usually buying equipment. So they
have been. They have been, and that's really the question.
And I think that's the opportunity, which is to translate that upfront capital requirement into a service.
And that's what you've done you started with light bulbs, right? I mean, just why buy the light bulb?
We did start with light bulbs, but why couldn't you do that for transport infrastructure? In other words, for fleets. And in fact, I think the issue actually is that exactly the point that you've made. The total cost of ownership, albeit over a 5 to 10 year period, is actually lower if you use more sustainable infrastructure. Therefore, the solution to unlock that is to enable the market to deliver it as a service.
So is there a word called infrastructuralize? Because if there isn't, I might have to.
I think you can add it to the European Commission.
Yeah, because what you're doing is you're infrastructuralizing these energy and transport services.
Let's do it.
Okay, we're getting a bit too philosophical here, but I want to come on to the sort of as a final block of what we need to, to talk through is this is all fabulous, right? It's a huge opportunity. We said that everything has to, for things for our economy, lifestyle to stay the same, our well-being, not just ours as the two of us, but around the world, and also people to be brought out of poverty and so on. Pretty much everything has to change in terms of efficiency. But why is now the time? I mean, you've spent 2007 till now. You spent 13 years.
Yeah.
And does the next 13 years just look like more of the same, sort of just slowly working your way up the north face of the Eiger, or is now a different point in time?
I genuinely feel like there's a massive opportunity to take step changes now. And I would say, if we look at what we've achieved as a firm in the last 2 years, we've achieved probably 5 times as much in the last 2 years as we achieved in the 10 years before. And I think there's a number of reasons for that.
It's kind of done this in the last 5 years.
Right? I think there's a number of reasons for that, right? So one of which is acceptance and the normalization. Right, you used infrastructuralization. I use normalization.
No.
So one of the things, something as obvious as changing a lamp from an incandescent light to LED, which might seem incredibly obvious today. This is basically a massive infrastructure revolution that's happened very quietly over the course of the last 8 years. So the numbers go like this: in 2012, only 2% of the world's lights were efficient. Today, 60%. So very few industries or modes of application or infrastructure ever change that much. And if you then say, okay, well, we've done something extraordinary to lighting, which is such a big...
But that's the technology shift, but there's also an ownership shift, as we talked about.
There's 3 things. It's technology, it's cost,
yeah,
and it's ownership and translated into a service. It's all 3 of those things happen. But then if you look at the things that are starting to take the same trajectory, and so a great example of this is if you read most scientific books or economic books will tell you that air conditioning is the number 1 route to carbon emission reduction. In fact, the most cost-effective way of reducing carbon emissions. And in fact, frankly, refrigerants in air conditioners can emit F gases 10,000 times more potent than CO2. So it's kind of air conditioning. But hey, most air conditioners aren't efficient yet, and in fact, we're going to install another 1 billion new air conditioners in the next 5 or 6 years. So take my lighting analogy and why things are going to look slightly different in the future than they have in the past, because we now understand and we've got the solutions, particularly if we can translate it into a service.
Do one thing
to
first.
Scale up these
technologies. Talk through, on the example of lighting, talk through your banking example. Because then you can you can ask the question, okay, what does that look like for air conditioning, which is a much bigger transaction value than just a few light bulbs. So what did you do in the banks?
So in the relatively early days, so from that point of 2% penetration of LEDs or energy efficient lights in 2012, about 2014-15, we worked with one of Europe's biggest banks,
retail banks,
and they looked at a portfolio of about 800 buildings in the UK, and one of the biggest uses of energy and costs for energy was lighting. By replacing the existing lights with LED, we could reduce the amount of energy demand and therefore the cost, because you pay for energy on a per kilowatt hour, by about 80 to 90%.
Okay.
By changing the lamps.
Right.
Now, the problem was exactly the one that you pointed out.
And you funded that?
Was CapEx,
right?
Because it was for the day-to-day facilities management organized budget within the business, relatively big. We funded it, so we took the CapEx problem off the table, and we said to the bank that we'd deliver light as a service for the next 10 years, and never had to worry about changing a light bulb for 10 years. White vans going across the country, responding to emergency call-outs was a problem of the past. We would replace the entire lighting estate, and we'd run it as a service for a fee. And that fee would be less than they were paying for their lighting before.
Yeah, and what I like about this story is there's something else that I know, which is how many fewer little vans do you have to have because LEDs last a lot longer?
Well, let's put it like this: they were spending a couple of £1 million a year on those white vans going around town or around the country changing lights. It's about 2,000 emergency call-outs a year.
Yeah.
that's evaporated.
Yeah, and that is a key point in all this, sort of bubbling away underneath, which is that it's the co-benefits. We talked about air quality,
Right.
and now we've talked about lower maintenance costs.
Yeah.
And in vehicles, there's some numbers out recently, I think from Underwriters Laboratory or somebody like that in the US, that electric vehicles have half of the maintenance costs of internal combustion. Just fewer moving parts,
makes
simpler.
sense, yeah.
Okay, so on the timing, why
Yeah.
now? You have got a lot. Some technologies have matured, and you've got smarter, and the contracts have probably become simpler, and you've understood your thing. But there's also some stuff going on in the world, and I'm thinking of the climate awareness. I'm thinking of COVID. I'm thinking of kind of the state of the world. Is that also are you feeling that change as well in the air?
Well, I mean, I'm looking for the evidence for it. And the evidence that I can see is, if you look at what the European Commission is doing, for example, on policy for the next 7 to 10 years.
So that's the Green Deal.
Well, take a step back. Let's look at the entire EU budgeting system for the next the 2020 to 27 budget.
That shouldn't take long. That's a simple thing.
Actually, it doesn't take long because actually my reading of it is like this. They're looking at the next decade's budget. They're redesigning the entire energy market in Europe because it's inefficient. They're trying to figure out 2030 carbon emission reduction targets and how they're going to achieve them.
So they're trying to up that.
And just in case there's not enough to do, they're trying to figure out the post-COVID stimulus packages. Yeah. And the biggest single thing that they've decided that they're going to focus on is green infrastructure. And the biggest single thing is called the European Green Deal. And the biggest single component of that is buildings efficiency.
Right.
So it's
and what sort of numbers are we talking about there?
So the numbers, if you extrapolate everything out, you're talking about investment from the European Commission plus private capital like ourselves, upwards of 350 billion euros a year.
Per year. 350 per year, billions. So I'm excited about this because, I wrote my most recent piece for Bloomberg New Energy Finance about energy efficiency, and I called it, in terms of COVID recovery, I called it the Swiss Army knife of COVID stimulus programs, because it kind of does a bit of everything. Right. So you've got the immediate, you do energy efficiency, and immediately you're employing the plumbers, the plasterers, the builders, the trades. You're also improving your long-term assets, and you're reducing that the economics we talked about, that long-term drag on the economy. Right. And also you're you're contributing to your climate goals. So that's now been built in, but in a massive way within the EU Green Deal.
It's in an incredible way. I mean, I have to come back to something though. You've got this massive policy drive in Europe. I don't know what's going to happen in the US, but one outcome of what happens over the next couple of months is a massive policy drive that looks very similar, by the way, to Europe. And I don't know what's going to happen in the UK, but what makes a lot of sense and what I'm hearing and what I'm hoping to hear more of in the UK is we're going to take some of the same principles. But come back to what we said.
The UK has legislated for net zero. I've been on the climate change committee, the sort of strategic advisory for the 6th carbon budget 2030 to 35. We have legislated that we have to get to net zero. So presumably we're going to have to come to the same conclusions as everybody else, that you can't do it without energy efficiency, right?
I would like energy efficiency, energy productivity, economic productivity to be one of, if not the key messages we can take into COP26.
And that's...
next November.
That's going to be next November. And of course there is a team beavering away on energy efficiency and COP26, also looking at it from the perspective of industrial standards, which presumably helps you because it produces the next thing after the LED light bulbs and the air conditioners, right?
Well, going back to my friend who said that real men build power plants, some of the technologies that make the biggest difference aren't that exciting. So changing light bulbs or changing motors, variable speed drives and industrial processes have a huge impact. As I said, refrigeration and air conditioning. Some of this stuff you don't even see. The irony, maybe the reason lights moved quickly is because you can see them.
Also because they have a limited lifetime, so there is this annoyance. You have to keep changing them. So
Correct,
there
yeah.
is an opportunity to step
Yeah.
in, perhaps. I don't know. Okay, so but the numbers you talked about, was it 350 billion per year? How does that compare to, let's call it, 2, 3, 5 years ago? I mean, just order of magnitude.
It doesn't make there is no comparison to draw, and this is what's so exciting. And to answer your question about,
So it's from a standing start.
I wouldn't say quite standing start.
No, it's not quite.
There is a relatively significant market, but we're not talking in the hundreds of billions.
I'm recalling Brian Motherway, who's the head of energy efficiency at the IEA, International Energy Agency. He used some figures recently, which was that there's about globally $200 billion per year spent on energy efficiency, and by 2030 it has to double twice.
Yes.
It has to double twice. So globally, I'm just doing the maths in my head, then it would need to get to 800 billion, and you're saying the EU has kind of stepped up and said,
they want to be a big
so
part
broadly
of that.
speaking, it is, so, well, if we use the two doublings, 8x in 10 years growth as a kind of rule of thumb, that's a pretty substantial opportunity for SDCL, is it not?
It's a huge opportunity for SDCL. In Europe, there's a huge opportunity in the United States. There's a massive opportunity further down the line and in a different way in China. I mean, China's just adopted groundbreaking, historic.
So why is it further down the line that they've been doing? I mean, they decided in 2005 that they couldn't keep growing their just supply side energy supply, building more and more coal. They started to kind of work on energy efficiency, did they not?
They did, and in 2006, in the 11th five-year plan, they committed to an energy productivity goal, which was 4% reduction in energy per unit.
I remember it. I'm scared that the two of us both remember this. The 11th five-year plan of the Chinese Communist Party. I mean, good credit to us. Let me just finish with one other question. Then, if you're talking about the developing world, now I mean the slower developing. No, it's not even slower developing, but the kind of, if we're talking about Africa, we're talking about India. Should they care about energy efficiency? And if so, these are places where there isn't energy access yet. Why should they care about energy efficiency?
I mean, in these markets and in these areas and regions, I think access to energy is really crucial. But you and I know extremely well that renewable energy is a fantastic way of delivering clean energy, or rather any type of energy. Into remote locations or difficult to reach locations. It's a fantastic story around decentralization,
right?
And local grids, microgrids, storage, self-reliance, resilience. I find that we talked about what is energy efficiency is. It's basically eliminating the inefficiency of the way energy is supplied, and decentralized energy and delivering energy to the point of use is a massive part of that. It's a huge opportunity for the developing world. And then, let's make sure that when those billion new air conditioners are bought over the next 5 or 6 years, that, we have a mechanism, and this is what we're working really hard with the foundations and people like the Kigali Cooling Initiative, which is backed by Bill Gates and the Hewlett Packard Foundations and so on. This is about trying to find ways that the new infrastructure that gets laid for the next 5 to 10 years is going to be efficient rather than massively polluting.
Because I sometimes say that the solar revolution that is bringing light and mobile phone charging and so on to some of these regions, it's actually an LED revolution. Because if you didn't have the efficient light bulb, then your solar panels would have to be so big that you wouldn't be able to afford them, or there wouldn't be space for them, and so and it's similar. It goes right across whether it's radios, TVs, whether it's I work with a company called Ignite Solar, and I have an investment in a company called Azuri. They're both delivering television, sort of television as a service, as it were. You can only do it if you have an efficient screen, and it's the same for cooling. It's the same for right across the board.
Well, an argument is that the developed world has created an energy infrastructure which is designed for a centralized, relatively inefficient system based on fossil fuels, and the future does not need to look like that.
Right. And my worry a little bit is what's what's happening to a certain extent is that our motors that are not, sort of variable speed are now being exported to these countries.
Yeah.
Maybe not the actual motors, but the designs. The same with, everything from sewing machines to refrigerators to air conditioning. And, that we've really got to stop that. And standards, I think, plays a big role.
The product standards, which of course is what the Urgent Action
good.
Energy Efficiency Task Force is about.
Well, look, it's been an absolutely enormous pleasure to chat with you about this. We rarely get the chance, despite the fact that we do quite a bit of stuff together, we rarely get the chance to sit down and just talk philosophically about what we're trying to achieve. So it's an enormous pleasure. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
And I hope that our audience has found it as stimulating and interesting as I have.
You too. Thank you very much, Michael.
Pleasure. So that was Jonathan Maxwell, CEO and founder of SDCL, one of the largest investors in energy efficiency anywhere in the world. And as you can see, somebody with a real vision for how we work on the demand side, integrated with the supply side, to bend the curve and get emissions down to where they need to be by 2030. My guest on Cleaning Up next week is somebody, like so many of my friends, that I met on Twitter. Auke Hoekstra is a researcher at the Eindhoven University of Technology. He's famous in the blogosphere and on Twitter for two things. One is debunking the nonsense that internal combustion engines are better for the climate than electric vehicles. The other is for auditing the outcomes of forecasts by the major energy agencies and pointing out that year after year after year, they undercook their predictions, their scenarios for renewable energy, particularly solar. Please join me next week when I will be talking to Auke Hoekstra.